Sorry, let me repeat that. So yes, now that we get the video up, we're going to take a look at the question right here. And so we have on the right the conventional graph we would see for cost curves, and let's take a look at which of these answer choices is right. So A, if marginal cost is rising, then average total cost is rising. And we see that that's not necessarily the case, right? Like, marginal cost is rising from this point onward, except we see that average total cost continues to decrease until marginal cost intersects with average total cost, right? So that's not going to be the right answer. B says if marginal cost is rising, then average variable cost is rising. And again, we see that's not necessarily the case. There's this period here where marginal cost is rising, but it's below average variable cost, and therefore AVC is still decreasing. And so that's not going to be the right answer. C says that if AVC is rising, then marginal cost is minimized. And so again, we see that's not the case. As AVC is rising, when we see that marginal cost is actually increasing even faster, and that's because AVC only rises when marginal cost is greater than variable cost. And finally, D, if average total cost is rising, then marginal cost is greater than average total cost. And here we see that is indeed the case because marginal cost intersects ATC at its lowest point, at its vertex. Every point up after that intersection where marginal cost is greater than the average total cost, your marginal cost is essentially pulling up the average, right? Because you're adding more and more high values into the average, and that's going to pull the average total cost up. And so if average total cost is at any point rising, then marginal cost is going to be greater than the average total cost. See, we see that already starting to occur here. And so it's going to be answer choice D that is the correct answer. Let's take a look at the answer choice by the previous tutor. And they said that the correct answer is D. A is incorrect because it is only partly true, as answer D covers this answer and more. Yeah, so again, A is not entirely true because there's a point in time where if marginal cost is rising, then average total cost is rising, but not all points. B says if marginal cost is rising. So they say B is incorrect because average variable cost rises when the firm increases production. Moreover, marginal cost intersects at AVC's lowest point. So that's the key point, that marginal cost intersects at AVC's low point. C is incorrect because marginal costs are costs covering production of a new unit. As a result, when marginal costs are below average variable costs, the average variable cost will also drop. And so, yeah, I think that covers the relationship pretty well. And then D says is the right answer. And so I think the only thing missing from this answer is an explanation for why D specifically is the right answer. So why don't we just add that in? And so we see here that D is the right answer because marginal cost intersects ATC at average total cost at ATC's lowest point, and therefore for every point afterwards where ATC is rising, marginal cost is greater than ATC. And so that's going to be our kind of modification of that solution, but almost largely correct. All right, let's take a look at the next answer choice. Or next question. Blank are typically comprised of a mix of blank and blank. And so, this is a question where if we were given answer choices, would not really know what is necessarily the case. We could guess, but typically we wouldn't see this type of question without an answer like multiple choice answer, or at least some sort of foreshadowing in a previous class. But if I had to guess without looking at the answers, what we're looking for here is probably something along the lines of an investment portfolio or something finance related, where you have a mix of assets that together create a single portfolio of investments. You might have something like some sort of portfolio is typically comprised of a mix of stocks and maybe like bonds or treasury notes and something like that, right? So we'll take a look at answer choices. Look at the previous answer to see what they put. And so they said mutual funds are typically comprised of a mix of stocks and bonds. And that's true. And so that's going to echo a lot of what I was talking about. You can think of a mutual fund as an investment portfolio that basically assembles a range of assets, of financial instruments that allows, and then it sells off shares of that entire portfolio to investors to invest in. And so what it really is it's providing very, very kind of cheap diversification in your investments. The reason you would invest in a mutual fund is because you want to have a diverse portfolio of investments. You want to have like 20% of my money is invested in this company, or that's already a lot. 20% of my money is invested in a certain industry of stocks. Another 20% is invested in treasury notes. Another 20% is invested in bonds, and another 20% is invested in a variety of other company stocks or indexes, right? To actually assemble that portfolio by yourself is very, very expensive. There are some costs that can cost several $100s, and you might only be able to afford one or two of those stocks, right? But you still want that diversification. And what mutual funds do is they provide a service where they pool the funds of investors who can't afford to basically create a very diverse portfolio of their own, and they pool together all of these stocks and bonds, all this money from a bunch of different investors, and then they go out and make a very diverse portfolio, and they create this whole quote-unquote pie made up of stocks, bonds, treasury notes, etc. And then they sell off slices of that pie, like slices that encompass a little percentage of everything in that entire portfolio, and you basically get a stake in the entire mutual fund, which is an already pre-diversified portfolio. And so that's what you would invest in a mutual fund for. And it has the advantage of allowing you to buy a slice of a very diverse portfolio without having to buy full stocks in all of these various companies, which might be very expensive. And you also, a lot of times they have managers, and so you don't have to manage the diversification very much yourself. So going back to the answer that the previous tutor provided, they're typically comprised of a mix of stocks and bonds, and that's generally true in terms of investing. Stocks and bonds are the predominant types of financial instruments. A mutual fund is a basket of various investments, such as stocks, bonds, and cash. A mutual fund is funded by the investments of individual investors and institutions, right? So you're collecting money of investors. Mutual fund companies professionally manage a portfolio of stocks and bonds by pooling the money of many investors. Mutual fund companies pool the money of many investors to buy the portfolio, and any gains and losses flow directly to them. So I think that last part is a little bit misleading. Mutual fund companies pool the money of many investors to buy this portfolio or assemble this portfolio is more accurate, the word. And that's true. But because, they're in exchange for the money of the investors, what they're promising is shares of the returns. Gains and losses do not flow directly to them, as in the companies or the managers, although they may get a cut. The gains and losses flow back to the investors, right? And so I think that's something that we want to modify here. Mutual fund companies do pool the money of investors to assemble a portfolio, but gains and losses flow directly. Oh, I see. Maybe they mean by directly as in like the fund initially gets the gains and losses, but the fund always has to pay out those gains and losses back to investors. So we'll say gains and losses ultimately flow to the investors and not the mutual fund managers' companies, although the managers' companies may take a small cut. So add that as an addendum, and that otherwise should be the correct answer. And then let's talk about the next question. So next question says, the unemployment rate may underestimate the true extent of unemployment if A, many people have a part-time as well as a full-time job. B, there are a large number of people working in the underground economy. C, many people become discouraged and cease looking for work. And D, employees increase the number of hours they work over time. And so this question is really testing us on how knowledgeable we are about the kind of definition of unemployment rate. And so the definition of unemployment rate is the, given by the equation, the number of unemployed people, not sure why the thickness changes, divided by number of people in the labor force. So note that it's a proportion out of the number of people in the labor force and not the proportion of people in the entire country. And so what this question is going to ask us is, how do we characterize people who are in the labor force? And there's two kind of conditions for that. The first is that you're able to work, and so that means you are of the appropriate age, you're an adult, you are you don't have a disability, there's no nothing barring you from working. And then the second condition is that you have searched for a job in the last 4 weeks. And so any basically meaning that you are actively looking for employment, right? And so anything that doesn't meet, anybody who doesn't meet those two criteria would not be considered a part of the labor force, and therefore would not be included in the unemployment rate. And so there is a class of workers which, although not included in the labor force, are able to work, and therefore should, by all other counts, be included as in the measurement of unemployment, and they are not. And so those people are what we refer to as discouraged workers. And so that means that they fulfill that first condition of having the ability to work, but they have not searched for a job in the last 4 weeks, and we call them discouraged workers because a lot of times it's because these people give up on finding a job and are no longer actively searching for a job. And so they become discouraged. And so answer choice C is going to be the one that is the most relevant in terms of this question, because discouraged workers are basically unemployed workers, yet they are not. They are part of the true unemployment rate, but they are not included in the official definition of the unemployment rate because they are not considered a part of the labor force, right? So, they're not considered. They're not considered a part of the labor force, and so we're going to have that be the issue that we're facing. And so let's take a look at the answer choice given before us. It says C, many people become discouraged and cease looking for work. And they find the prolonged is a state of being unemployed. I'm not sure what prolonged work refers to here, so we might have to modify that. The more discouraged. Oh, okay, I see. The prolonged is the state of being unemployed. So the longer someone is unemployed, the more discouraged an individual becomes, eventually succumbing to situations and cease their pursuit of job opportunities. A discouraged worker is considered out of the labor force. The collection of such individuals who are unemployed but are not counted as unemployed causes a severe understatement of the unemployment rate. The unofficial unemployment rate considers an individual unemployed if he or she is willing and able to contribute to the workforce and is actively looking for a job, but is not able to get an opportunity. Yeah, so that's right. And I think there are some things in the beginning that are confusing, but this last part definitely clarifies what we refer to as unemployment, right? And we're going to add an addendum for what labor force is defined as. So good solution, labor force is defined. Labor force is characterized by people fulfilling two conditions. One, they are able to work, and two, they have actively looked for a job in the last 4 weeks. Because discouraged workers do not actively look for jobs, they are not included in the labor force. Add that in as well. And otherwise, the solution is correct. So we have the next question that says, one major component of GDP that can be negative is which one of the following? And so we want to go to our GDP equation. And what we're dealing with here is that when we do a consumption approach, so Y, which is GDP, is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, which is given by exports minus imports, right? And so all components of GDP will fall under one of these 4 categories, right? And so the question is, which major component of GDP can be negative? And so consumption, we'll go down the line. Consumption cannot be negative, right? Consumption is going to occur not just every year, but every day. And so there's no force that makes consumption negative, right? We're only counting positive transactions that increase our consumption count. Same goes for investments. There's no such thing as a negative investment. Maybe from a financial accounting standpoint, you could have negative investments if you're taking away from your inventory. But from a GDP standpoint for an entire country, it's hard to see why investment will be negative. It is basically always positive. Government spending, again, is a positive count. Government will always spend. Keep in mind that this isn't net government spending, so government spending minus tax revenue or anything. It is just how much that government spends, and so expenditure is not going to be negative anyway, and that's not possible. And finally, net exports. And so here we get to a period in which we could have a negative component of GDP, and that's because if we run a trade deficit where our exports are less than our imports, then the greater quantity of imports is going to cause net exports to be negative, basically, and that's going to decrease GDP. And that's something that can happen sometimes. And so we know that it's possible for exports to be less than imports, or imports to be greater than exports. And if that causes GDP to be negative, then that is going to be not negative. If that causes GDP to decrease, then that would be the answer that we're looking for here. So let's take a look at this answer choice. The answer should be net exports. So let's take a look. So they say more broadly, the GDP of any nation can be seen as the aggregate of its total consumption, total investment, total government spending, and net exports. Out of the above 4 factors, only net exports, given by exports minus imports, could turn out to be negative when the quantity of imports in a nation overpasses its export quantity. And so that's correct. We can say minor grammatical issues, but correct answer conceptually. And that is going to cover the correct solution. Okay, so now let's take a look at this question here. And so it says, if there's a shortage of loanable funds, then which one of the following is true? And it gives us a bunch of relationships between the quantity of loanable funds demanded, quantity of loanable funds supplied, and interest, right? And something about equilibrium. So the question is, like, what the heck are we talking about here? And the answer is that we're talking about the loanable funds market. And so this is something that is covered in macroeconomics, and it seems maybe a little bit different or hard to understand at first, but it really isn't. It's just another supply and demand model. And so this supply and demand model really shows us the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds being traded and the real interest rate. And so let's take a look here. And so we have, instead of having price here, we have the real interest rate. And over here on the x-axis, we have, instead of quantity of goods, we have quantity of loanable funds. And then everything else is basically the same. We have a demand curve for loanable funds given by how much money is being asked for in terms of loans, and we have this negative relationship between the real interest and the demand curve because the interest rate can be thought of as like the expensiveness of a loan, right? So demand for loanable funds is basically the demand. You can think about it as, if I want to take out a loan, then I'm contributing to the demand of loanable funds. And you aggregate all the demand for loanable funds, and that gives you the demand curve. And the reason we have this negative relationship between real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds demanded is because if interest rates are high, that is going to decrease the incentive for people to take out loans, because it means that they have to return the loans they take out at higher rates, and that's bad. And so if we have high interest rates over here, we're going to have low quantity of funds demanded. On the flip side, we see that if real interest rates decrease and they're low, then the quantity of loanable funds demand is going to be high. And that's actually something we see right now, where with the interest rates being really low, with the Fed setting interest rates really low, that's basically stimulating people to borrow more and trying to stimulate the economy. We want people to borrow and invest and build things and be productive. And that's given when you have a low interest rate and you promise there to be low interest kind of charges on these loans. And on the other hand, we have the supply curve. This is again the supply curve for loanable funds, and that's given by the willingness of people to provide funds and loan them out to other people. So we can think about this as savings. So something as simple as putting money into a bank, you're essentially supplying money for loanable funds because you're not using it and you're allowing the bank to loan out that money. And so the question is, what is the relationship between how much I'm willing to put in my bank account and how much real interest rate is? And the answer is, you can think of when you open a savings account, you look at the interest rate that you earn on that savings account, and if the interest rate were high, you'd be more willing to put more money into your savings account because you know that the return on those savings is going to be higher. On the other hand, if you have a 0.25% of interest being earned on your savings account, there's really less motivation for you to put that money into savings because you could just spend it right now, and you don't forgo the opportunity of earning more interest payments in the future. And so that's going to be that kind of dynamic which explains the upward slope of supply curve. And putting that all together, we get an equilibrium, right? We get an equilibrium quantity of loanable funds, and we get an equilibrium interest rate of what the interest rate would be. And so just like any supply and demand model, this should be kind of the equilibrium point that we see in the loanable funds market. Okay, so now that we understand the setup for the loanable funds market, the question is which of these answer choices is true. So the first thing we have to note is the question gives us a scenario of a shortage of loanable funds, where we have to understand what that means. So for there to be a shortage, it means there are too many people who want loans and not enough people to provide the loans. And therefore, we're going to see something less, a real interest rate less than the equilibrium interest rate, where there's some sort of gap right here, right? Oh, that's a bad line. Let's try that one more time. And so this gap given over here, that is our shortage, right? We have this much quantity being demanded in the market for loanable funds, and we only have this much quantity being supplied by lenders. And so that is our shortage. And so which one of these answer choices is going to actually describe the situation the best? The quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied. That is true. And so it's looking good so far. And it says the interest rate is above equilibrium. And that's where it's wrong, right? We see here that the interest rate is clearly below the equilibrium interest rate over here. And so we're not going to be dealing with that as the right answer. B says the quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied, and the interest rate is below equilibrium. And I think that captures it perfectly. We have demand is greater than supply, and we also have interest rate is below equilibrium. Let's just take a look at the other ones to make sure. It says the quantity of loanable funds supplied is greater than the quantity of loanable funds demanded, and so does D, and we know that's not the case. That is what we would call a surplus, which would be up here, right? And that's not something that we deal with. And so again, the idea of a shortage and a surplus in the loanable funds market is the exact same as the idea of a shortage or surplus in a conventional supply and demand market model. And so just understanding that and not getting too scared by the loanable funds market or loanable funds model is going to keep it pretty easy to understand here. Okay, so now we understand what the right answer is. Why don't we take a look at the next question? The answer choice. So it says option B is correct, and that's true. The quantity of loanable funds demanded is greater than the quantity of loanable funds supplied, and the interest rate is below equilibrium. The quantity demanded of loanable funds are investments, and the quantity supplied of loanable funds are savings of a country. And yes, that's correct. If there's a shortage of loanable funds, that will mean that quantities demanded investments are greater than quantity supplied, right? Thus, when savings is less than investment, that will create a shortage of loanable funds in the market, and the interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level. And so the only issue here is that it just says that interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level, and we can provide a slight explanation for that. And so interest rate will lie below the equilibrium level, because a shortage on the loanable funds graph by definition demands a real interest rate less than the equilibrium. From a theory standpoint, an interest rate that is too low causes there to be a unordinarily high demand for investments because the cost of taking out a loan is cheap. Meanwhile, that low interest rate causes there to be an unordinarily low supply of savings because there is less return on money placed into savings. These two factors contribute to the shortage. Right, and so let's see what all these little, what did I spell wrong here? I guess unordinarily is not a word. Let's be an inefficiently high demand, inefficiently low supply. Normal funds, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. And so this is going to give a little bit more clarity because I think the answer choice really hit the nail on the head when it was talking about, which is greater quantity demand or quantity supply, but it doesn't really explain why interest rate is necessarily lower than equilibrium, and that's the difference between A and B. And so hopefully this answer choice talking about both the loanable funds graph that they can look up and also the factors contributing to, the actual relationship between interest rate and supply and demand is going to cause there to be more of a understanding of the actual model and relationship. But yeah, so that should be it. And so let's take a look at the next answer choice. And so the next question says, how would a strong US dollar impact the trade of grain produced in the United States? Just kind of talking about the exchange rate and also the impact of the exchange rate on exports. So the first question is, what does a strong US dollar really refer to? And it basically means that the dollar is going to be, a strong US dollar means that it is more quote unquote expensive in terms of foreign currency, and that other currencies, other countries have to pay more in order to buy a good given in US dollars. And so you might think of a country that used to have a 1-to-1 exchange rate with the United States dollar. Now, with a strong US dollar, might have a 2-to-1 exchange rate with the US dollar, where it costs 2 of the other country's currency to exchange for $1, and that makes the US dollar more strong because it buys more other currency. And so, how does that affect trade of grain produced in the United States? And so, what that's going to mean is that that's going to affect exports. And exports, again, refers to when domestic sellers are selling goods on the international market to other countries. And so, because we're exporting, those prices are given in US dollars. And a strong US dollar essentially makes all of these goods, even though the price tag might not have changed, in effect, a strong US dollar makes all these goods more expensive because other countries' currencies, other buyers need to pay more in their own country's currencies in order to buy the same amount and same priced US grain. And so to increase effectively the price of grain is going to It's going to decrease the quantity demanded for that grain, and that's going to cause US grain exports to decrease. And that's going to be the main effect of a US of increasing the US dollar strength. And on the other hand, you'd also see imports increasing because US dollars buy more of other countries' goods. They're worth more in other countries' currencies, and so we also might see an answer choice that says U.S. grain imports increase, although hopefully we wouldn't see both. And so here we only see that U.S. grain exports decrease. And that's going to be the right answer. We know it's not going to increase, and we know that imports are going to increase, not decrease or stagnate. So let's take a look at the rationale given by the previous tutor. So previous tutor says if the U.S. grain exports decrease, if the value of the U.S. dollar appreciates, making the domestic currency relatively stronger than foreign currency, domestic buyers will find themselves at a position of advantage, for they will have to pay less for the imports they receive. The imports will become cheaper due to a strong dollar. At the same time, foreign buyers will have to pay a greater than before amount for the same amount of grain that is being exported. An increase in the price of exports of grain will lead to a decrease in its quantity demanded. Hence, U.S. grain exports will decrease. Eventually, the gap between imports and exports will shrink as imports increase and exports decrease, and net exports will decrease. Yeah, that's true. So I think that covers the gist of it. It covers more than we had to know because it also covers the import side of things. So I think this is a great solution. I want to say very thorough solution. Okay, so this question I think refers to a lot of, so we've got a lot of production possibilities frontier questions here. So we're going to take a step and try and nail all of these. Let me also see if the other tutor did all these questions. Yes, okay. So, let's attach an explanation for all this. So, question number 1. A bowed-out production possibilities frontier reflects which of the following ideas? Number 1, increasing opportunity costs. Number 2, resources are not equally productive in all activities. Number 3, prices of goods increase over time. So let's draw our conventional, production possibilities frontier. Or let's draw a little bit prettier one. we have our PPF, we have good X and good Y, right? Well, PPF is usually a trade-off between two goods. So this was a two-good model. And we have a bowed outward. The question is why? And so the answer is going to be, number one, increasing opportunity costs. And so opportunity cost is basically saying how much, if I produce one more good, let's say good X, how much am I giving up in terms of good Y? And so the opportunity cost is going to look something like this. So let's say this is the first unit. I go from producing no units of good X to 1 unit of good X, and I see what is the opportunity cost? It's this drop right here, right? If this is where, I hope I can draw this correctly. If this is where the production is of good Y and good X, if I produce 1 unit of good X, then the drop from the initial production point of right here to right here, that's the initial opportunity cost. Now let's say move on to a second good. Apologies for my dotted line. Let's try this one more time. Oh, just deleted everything. Right, so that's going to be right here, and so we see a little bit of a bigger drop. We go to right here, an even bigger drop, and right here. An even bigger drop. And so we can see that as opportunity cost is, as you continue to produce more and more of good X, what's happening is that the opportunity cost is increasing over time. You start off with the first unit and it barely puts a dent into your production of Y. The second unit puts a little bit more of a dent, and by the time you're producing mostly good X, you're giving up a lot of good Y in order to do that much production. And so that's something that is referred to as increasing opportunity cost, and it's by definition given by the curve of the PPF, the outward bowing of the PPF, right? We would not see this to be the case if we had a PPF with a straight line. That was just a straight line that had no bow whatsoever, and that would tell us that there's actually no increase in opportunity cost. It would tell us that there's constant opportunity cost. And so when we have a bowed out PPF, we know that we're dealing with a situation with increasing opportunity costs over time. The second answer choice says resources are not equally productive in all activities, and so that is also true, and this kind of gives a rationale for why opportunity cost might be increasing. So think of two goods that are entirely different, right? Let's say grain and cars. For you to produce those two goods, you have a certain set of resources to produce and apply to the production of both those goods. Some of those resources are better suited to producing one of those goods than the other. You might have a lot of steel, and that's going to be really helpful for building cars, and not that helpful for growing grain. You might have a lot of seeds, and I also don't know what you would use seeds for in a car, right? And that's going to be much more productive to be used for grain. So what the bowed out nature of the production possibilities frontier says to us is that if we produce both goods in moderation, we can use our resources where they are the most optimally productive. Resources that are meant to be used or better suited to be used to build cars will be used on cars, and we'll use the rest of our resources which are not productive for cars but are productive for grain, and we'll use all those to grow grain. When you approach the extremes, you see very, very large drop-offs in opportunity cost. You can think of a drop from this point here to this point here. You basically lose a huge chunk of your production of good Y. And the reason we do that, we see that happening, is because if you're saying I'm utilizing 100% of my resources to building cars, even though a lot of my resources are actually better suited to be used towards growing grain, then to use all of your seeds and all of your fertilizer and all of your tractors to build cars is entirely inefficient, and therefore you're going to suffer that inefficiency in the form of very high opportunity costs and how much you lose in grain production by devoting all of your resources to building cars. And so that's going to give us that explanation for why opportunity costs might be increasing, because resources are not equally productive in all activities. And finally, prices of goods increase over time, and so there's no element of time that is incorporated into this model, and therefore 3 is not going to be right. So we're going to say that the correct answer choices 1 and 2. So right here, and let's see what the previous tutor said. They also said 1 and 2. So that's good. So let's take a look at the next question. They said that question 2. With no international trade, a country blank consume at a point outside of its PPF. With international trade, a country blank consume at a point outside of its PPF. And so this is more of a, you could draw this on a graph. I'm not going to, because I think this is more of a conceptual understanding of the benefits of trade. And so one of the inherent principles of economics, you might recall there being 10 principles of economics overall in your first chapter of macro or micro. One of those is that trade benefits everybody. And so what trade does is it allows countries to specialize and produce goods in which they have a comparative advantage, and then they can trade to kind of get access to the other goods that they don't produce, which other countries specialize in that they have a comparative advantage. And so trade is going to allow countries to pursue or consume at points outside of the PPF, and we're going to see that we can define there to be 3 main zones of the PPF, right? And we have zone A, we have zone B, which is on the line, and then we have zone C. Conventionally speaking, and this is a too good model where there's no trade, C is impossible. You simply do not have the resources or the technology or productivity to put together resources for bundles outside of the production possibilities frontier. Like the name suggests, it is outside the possibilities of production. It's inaccessible. A, on the other hand, is the other region in which it's entirely possible to produce those bundles of goods between X and Y, goods X and Y, but it's actually inefficient because you're not utilizing all of your resources. You could actually produce more if you have a consumption bundle in area A. And in consumption bundles on the curve, which is what we're going to refer to as area B, are optimal in that they fully use all of the resources available. So there's no inefficiency in terms of resource usage. There might be, certain bundles which make you happier, but in terms of a productive efficiency standpoint, B is fully efficient because it uses all of your resources and you can't produce anything more. Trade breaks this assumption of there being a limit and says that, yes, if you can trade, you can specialize. That allows you to break the bounds of the PPF and actually consume on points that are outside in area C. And so, on the other hand, with no trade, it is not possible to do that. And so we can use this knowledge of the relationship to answer the question. It says, with no international trade, a country can or cannot consume at a point outside of its PPF. And we're going to say cannot, right? Consuming outside of PPF is not possible without engaging in trade. And then the other question is, with international trade, a country can or cannot consume at a point outside of its PPF. The answer is it can. So we're going to go cannot and can, and hopefully that's what the previous tutor said, and they said cannot and can, which is great. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. Number 3, if the PPF between 2 goods is a straight line, then which of the following is true? And I briefly mentioned this in the previous question, right? The PPF, so we have this conventional idea of a PPF with a bowed out frontier. We can also have one where it's simply a straight line. And this is still good X and good Y. This is good X and good Y. And so we ask ourselves, what does this mean, right? And so if we think of the slope at any point in time of a production possibilities frontier as its opportunity cost between x and y, then having a constant slope given by a straight line means that the opportunity cost is constant rather than increasing. Right? In question 1, we talked about how one of the factors of a bowed out possibilities frontier is increasing opportunity costs. With a straight possibilities frontier, it is in fact going to be constant opportunity cost. And so that might mean that, for example, resources would be equally productive in both goods, and therefore it doesn't matter which one you use between. We can think of the difference between producing cars and motorcycles, where a lot of those resources are going to overlap, and you could actually probably use your resources to produce any of those, and there's no trade-off in terms of loss of efficiency and productive allocation of resources. And so we can take a look at the answer choices to see which one of these is going to closely match our scenario. It says the line does not qualify as a production possibilities frontier because the unattainable production points are too close to the inefficient production points. That's not true. Unattainable, that I'm not sure what it means by too close. That's just a boundary between the PPF and the region C outside of the line, which is unattainable. So that's not true. Number B, opportunity cost is not a ratio. So opportunity cost is always a ratio between good X and good Y, and so that's not the case. Increasing opportunity costs, that's going to cause there to be a bowed out PPF, not a straight line. And finally, resources are equally productive in both goods. And that's going to be the explanation which best encompasses why we see that the straight line is different. And that's because we have that equal productive nature of those resources. So resources are equally productive in both goods is going to be the right answer. And that's the answer choice that the tutor chose as well. So that's great. So let's see question 4. As an economy produces more of one of the goods on a bowed out production possibilities frontier, what happens to the opportunity cost of producing the good? So again, this goes back to what we talked about in the first question, which says, as you produce more of one good, you find there to be increasing opportunity costs at every level, right? Starting from the first unit you produced all the way until the last unit you can possibly produce. And so because opportunity cost consistently increases with a bowed out PPF, then opportunity cost is always going to go up as you produce more of one of the goods. And so it increases is going to be the right answer here. And that is, in fact, the right answer that the previous tutor put, so that's great. Number 5. Comparative advantage is defined as a situation in which one person can produce which one of the following. And so this is a definition question. We can think of 2 different types of advantages. The first type is going to be comparative advantage, and then the second type is absolute advantage. Absolute advantage says who can produce more, period, right? And if I can produce more than you, then I have an absolute advantage. Comparative advantage is the one that really matters, especially when we're talking about trade, because that decides what you specialize in. And it's saying, what good can I produce at a lower opportunity cost than you can? And that basically means that I have to give up less of another good in order to produce this good. And so that's going to be the definition of producing a good at a lower opportunity cost than someone else. And so looking through answer choices, we see that answer choice C, a situation in which one person can produce a good for a lower opportunity cost than another person, is going to be the right answer here. So let's take a look at the answer that the tutor put. It says, number 5, a good for a lower opportunity cost than another person. So great, they got that right as well. Question 6. When a production possibilities frontier is put outward as more of one good is produced, its opportunity cost. I think this is, we covered this in previous questions. Because a bowed out PPF is defined by increasing opportunity costs for all increased production at either good, then opportunity costs are going to increase because that's just the bowed out nature of the good. So we're going to see increases. I think that's going to be the right answer. And we've covered that several times already in these 3 questions. So yes, increases is the right answer. Question 7. A bowed out production possibilities frontier shows that a again, like a lot of the previous questions that we talked about, one of the things that the bowed out production possibilities frontier shows is an increasing opportunity cost as good production increases. And so opportunity cost of a good increases as more of the good is produced. That is going to be the correct answer. Opportunity of good increases as more of the good is produced. So Tutor got it right. Number 8, which of the following statements is correct? The production possibilities frontier shows that there are no limits to production. In fact, it does not. That's the opposite of what it shows. So it shows that there are absolutely limits to production given by the frontier, and C is not possible. B says any point on or within PPF is production efficient. Again, we said that yes, if you're on the PPF, you're efficient, but if you're within the PPF, you are possible but not efficient. That is area A we see over here, and that is something that you could be using more of the resources because you have resources left over that aren't being used. C says if capital is idle, the economy is producing at its full potential. Again, if you have capital that is idle, which means it's not being used, then the economy is not producing at its full potential because you could be using that capital for production. And then finally, a trade-off is a limit that forces an exchange or a substitution of one thing for something else. That is a definition. And yes, that is what a trade-off says. It says we have limited resources. You have to choose between two things. And so that is going to be the correct answer here. And so let's take a look. Question 8. A trade-off is a limit that forces an exchange or a substitution of one thing or for something else. So that's correct. Okay, question 9. A major earthquake occurs in the central part of the United States. What impact would this have on the nation's PPF and why? And so we would estimate that the PPF would be reduced because of a reduction in productivity from capital, or maybe loss of resources, or something like that. So a trade-off would occur to replace the resources and goods destroyed. I think it's possible. Well, we can look at the other answer choices to take a look. It would shift inward because some of the nation's resources, such as capital and labor, would be destroyed. That's much more likely to be the case because, again, a loss of resources is going to shrink the possibilities of what you can produce. If you lose all your factories, there's no way you can produce as many cars or motorcycles as you did before. C says it would shift outward because unemployment would be reduced. I'm unsure why an earthquake would reduce unemployment, and so we're not going to pick that one. Nothing would happen because the nation would still have the same capabilities. Again, I think if they say a major earthquake in the central part of the United States, then the assumption is that the capabilities of the nation would have decreased because of again, like answer choice B says, loss of capital and labor. So we're going to pick answer choice B, and let's take a look if that's the right answer here. And yes, it would shift inward because some of the nation's resources, such as capital and labor, would be destroyed. So that's great. That's going to be the right answer there. Great. So moving along, question 10. When a nation is producing on its PPF, if more resources are used to produce one good than the production of other goods, and the answer choice is, say, increase, decrease, remain the same, change, but they may increase or decrease. Again, what the PPF tells us if you're on this curve, right? If you're on the PPF, you're on region B, then if you use more of one resource, you are by definition taking resources away from the production of another good. So using more resources to produce good X means if you're on the curve, means you have to take away resources from good Y. So the rule is that if you're producing more of one good, then the production of the other good must decrease because you're taking away resources and you only have a limited amount of resources. So that's going to be must decrease, question 10. Yes, must decrease, and that's correct. Question 11. Moving along on country's PPF, a reason that opportunity costs increase is that, and again, we covered this in one of the first questions in this set, but it says that unemployment increases as a country produces more and more of one good. There's no suggestion of unemployment really on the PPF. It's more about resource allocation. So that's not being the case. Unemployment decreases as a country produces more and more of one good. Nope. Some resource sources are better suited for producing one good rather than the other, and this goes back to our kind of explanation of, if you have goods to produce between grain and cars, there are certainly some resources that are more well suited to cars like steel or wheels than they are for grain. And so that opportunity cost of continuing to produce one good means you might be taking away resources that are better suited for producing another good. And so that is going to be the correct answer. And finally, technology declines as the country produces more and more of one good. That's not the case. Technology is not correlated with production quantity of one good. In fact, you might even suggest that technology might increase as you produce more of one good, as you invest more into understanding how to produce that good efficiently. So the correct answer is that some resources are better suited for producing one good rather than the other. Let's take a look at the answers. Yeah, question 11. Some resources are better suited for producing one good rather than the other. Great. Question 12. A reason that the production possibilities frontier exists is scarcity of resources and unlimited technology. And so scarcity of resources, definitely, right? Like you have a limited amount of resources. You can only produce two goods. You therefore are limited by the frontier. Unlimited technology, however, is not the case. We are also limited by technology because technology is what allows us to assemble our resources together. Unlimited technology kind of assumes that we are infinitely advanced in our technology, and we could probably create crazy, unimaginable things from scarce resources, very low amounts of resources, and that's not the case. PPF is defined both by limited scarcity and also limited technology. Sorry, limited resources and limited technology. Unemployment, again, we don't really see that link between unemployment and PPF. Maybe you can think of resources of labor, but again, if you're on the PPF, then you don't have labor unemployment. Scarcity of resources, that's again definitely one of those answers that's going to contribute to PPF, so we're going to keep an eye on that one. And finally, unlimited resources technology. Again, we said we need to talk about scarcity of resources. Having unlimited resources would mean there's no frontier. Like you have infinite amount of everything, and so there's no reason you couldn't produce everything you wanted to produce. So it's going to be scarcity of resources. That's the correct answer. And so scarcity of resources and unlimited technology. And so I'm going to push back on that question from the previous tutor and say that if you have unlimited technology, you wouldn't have the PPF as well. And so we'll make a note of that for question 12. Scarcity of resources. Having unlimited technology would not be a condition of PPF because that assumption would mean we would be able to assemble resources in an infinitely efficient manner. That would not cause production to be limited in the way the PPF does. So let's take a look at question 13 then. Moving from one point to another on a production possibilities frontier implies what? And so again, we're talking about area B, and so we can take a look at what it means. Increase in the production of one good and decrease in production of another. And it does in fact do that because each point on the PPF is going to be a different bundle of goods. And so you will have to, because there's only two goods, increase the production of one and decrease the other. The second says increase in production of both goods. Again, if we're already on the frontier, it's not possible to produce both goods more because that would put us in area C, which is not possible. It's unattainable. Decrease in production of both goods, that would put us into area A, and that would be inefficient. And so because we're saying we're moving on the PPF and not into a PPF or away from PPF, then it's not going to be decrease in production. And finally, holding production levels of both goods constant. Because we're moving points, then we know it's not a constant production level, that we know that one good is being produced more. If we go from, like, let's say here to here, but that's good X. If we go from here to here, it's good Y, and vice versa, decrease in the production of another because there's a trade-off. So we're going to see that be the right answer. Increase in the production of one good and decrease in the production of another. So that's correct. Okay, let's do question 14. Specialization and trade make a country better off because of trade the country can consume at a point outside its production possibilities frontier, on its trading partner's production possibilities frontier, inside or on its PPF. I think, yeah. And so again, we talked about this in the previous question about trade benefiting everybody, and we see that a two-good model in a PPF assumes that you don't trade, and to allow trade is to make it possible to reach previously unattainable points through specialization in trade. And so we're going to see that the correct answer is that specialization in trade allows a country to consume at a point outside its PPF because it no longer suffers a trade-off, a domestic trade-off. It allows you to incorporate the resources available to another country and produce at a point that is okay for both countries outside their PPFs. So the correct answer is outside its PPF. Outside its PPF. So the next question, question 15, says, the production possibilities frontier is which of the following? The boundary between the combinations of goods and services that can be produced and the combinations that cannot be produced when technology is changing. So yes, I'm not sure about the technology is changing. I don't think that is one of the conditions. So we'll take a look at the other answer choices. Minimum output that can be produced when resources are used inefficiently. No. If you're on the PPF, you assume efficient use of resources. So that's not going to be right. 3, boundary between the combination of goods and services that can be produced and the combinations that cannot be produced, given the available factors of production in the state of technology. So yes, that is correct. You assume that there's, in the status quo, a certain amount of factors of production and a certain level of technology, and PPF gives you the boundary for what can and cannot be produced, given that state. So that's going to be the right answer, probably. Finally, maximum output that can be produced at an opportunity cost of 0. There's no opportunity cost of 0. There's always an opportunity cost, so that's not going to be the right answer. So question 15 is going to give us that long answer about a boundary. Yeah, so boundary between the combination of goods and services that can be produced and the combinations that cannot be produced, given the available factors of production and the state of technology. Question 16. The opportunity cost of economic growth is what, and the benefit of economic growth is what? And so this is not something directly related to PPF, but it talks about what we're basically the relationship between growth and consumption. So growth is going to require investment. And so you can think about having money as doing 2 things. You can either spend it or you can save it. And saving is a form of investment. So you can only spend it or invest it. To create growth, you're going to have to invest. And you cannot consume in the current period, and you will reap greater consumption in a later period, but not right now. And so you have to invest in the current period, invest in capital, invest in education, invest in labor and stuff. And so that's going to be a decrease in current consumption. But the benefit is that if you experience economic growth, later on in the future, after growth, you would find an increased ability to consume because there's more resources available. So we're going to see an answer choice that says the opportunity cost of economic growth is decreased current consumption and the benefit is increased future consumption. So that's going to be this choice right here. Decreased current consumption, increased future consumption. And let's see if the tutor got it right. Increased current consumption and decreased future consumption. So that gets the relationship flipped. And we're going to say it's actually the opposite. Increased current. So it's actually decreased current consumption and increased future consumption. Economic growth requires investment in the current period, which means consumption decreases currently. In the future, after growth, there are more resources available, and therefore consumption can increase. So we're going to push back on that. Or sorry, I don't think it's question 13. It's question 16. All right, so let's do question 17. In terms of a nation's productive possibilities frontier, what impact does international trade have? And so international trade is going to allow us again to achieve at a point outside this PPF, and allows us to access previously unattainable points. And so it does not shift the PPF. The PPF still refers to domestic trade-offs, right? It does not incorporate international resources. And so the PPF doesn't move, and therefore all 3 of these answers are wrong. They all talk about shifts in the PPF. That's not the case. Trade is just allowing us to attain bundles that we would not be able to attain without it. right? And so that's going to be answer choice T. International trade allows the nation to consume at a point outside its PPF. So let's see, question 17. Yeah, international trade allows the nation to consume at a point outside its PPF. Great. Cool. Question 18. The production possibilities frontier illustrates the which of the following? It says goods and services that people want. That's not the case. You know, a PPF assumes two models, a two-good model, but it does not necessarily assume that those two goods are the only ones that people want. It illustrates the limits to people's wants. And so it's not necessarily about wants in this case, but more about production. So we're on a supplier's perspective rather than the consumer's. So that's not going to be the case there. Resources the economy possesses, but not its level of technology. But in fact, it does illustrate a level of technology, because if we had high technology, we would have a greater PPF. If we had low technology, we'd have a lower or smaller PPF. And finally, the maximum combinations of goods and services that can be produced. And that is in fact the case. The PPF, anything on area B, is going to show us that if you are on B, that combination is going to be the maximum number. You're using all of your resources to produce that combo. So the full range of bundles you can achieve by using all of your resources is illustrated by the PPF. So it's going to be that question 18, maximum combinations of goods and services that can be produced. Yeah, maximum combinations of goods and services that can be produced. Next question. As we move along the production possibilities frontier, which of the following occurs? The possibilities of trade-offs diminish. That's not true. There's always trade-offs along the PPF. The production of one good increases as the production of the other good decreases. And that is true, right? Because we're moving along the PPF, there's inherently an exchange in resources. There's only two goods in this economy, and therefore if I produce more of one good by moving along the PPF this way, I produce more of good X, I have to take away resources from the production of good Y. So that's going to be the case here. More of both goods can be produced. Again, you know, PPF assumes a trade-off, so you can never have a situation if you're already on the PPF where more of both goods can be produced, only one good. And finally, a trade-off is not possible because nations need all goods, and so again, that's not the case. The PPF is literally a curve that illustrates trade-offs between two goods. So that's not the right answer. So it's going to be the production of one good increases and the production of the other good decreases. Yeah, so that's the right answer that the previous tutor put. The production of one good increases as the production of the other good decreases. Answer choice question 20. What is the opportunity cost of economic growth? So it says eliminate scarcity. So you don't give up. That's not the answer. Economic growth. There's nothing that eliminates scarcity. There will always be scarcity, right? So that's not going to be the case. Land and capital goods. So you would actually most likely not be taking opportunity cost refers to what you give up. You most likely would actually be increasing the amount of land and increasing the amount of capital goods you have by investing in economic growth, because those are things that are going to increase your ability to produce. So those are not really the case. Consumption goods is going to be the correct answer, and that's because by investing in economic growth, you give up the ability to consume in the current period, because again, like we said, with your money, you can only do two things. You can either consume or you can invest. And if you choose to invest, then you decrease your consumption. And so consumption goods is going to be the correct answer here. So question 20. Please, no. Oh boy, I lost all our explanations. So I think it's questions 12 and 16. Hopefully it saved. It did not. Oh, here, great. So it did not save. Okay, so what are our answers? Really quickly, we said scarcity of resources, unlimited technology means we would be able to assemble resources in infinitely efficient ways, which breaks the assumption of scarcity in the PPF. And 16 said decreased current consumption, increased future consumption. Economic growth requires investment in the current period, which inherently decreases the amount of money available for consumption. Economic growth leads to future increases in consumption because it leads to more resources being available. Okay, so let's again take a look at what we were talking about. And I think question 20 was what we were on. And so what is opportunity cost of economic growth? And it says eliminate scarcity. That's not the correct answer, so we have to modify that as well. The correct answer is actually, was it consumption spending, was it? Consumption goods. And for the same rationale that we gave before, we're going to say, there we go, that's the correct answer. 21. Which of the following statements is correct? As the economy grows, the opportunity cost of economic growth decreases. No, we know that opportunity cost of growth is going to increase over time. Opportunity cost is always increasing, and so that's not going to be the case. Economic growth has no opportunity cost. That's not correct. The opportunity cost of economic growth is current foregone consumption. So I'm going to say answer choice 3 only, because as the economy grows, the opportunity cost of economic growth decreases. Normally, if you're investing more and more into certain things, the opportunity cost is going to increase no matter what. And so that's going to be the case there. So answer 3 only. So yeah, 21. They got 21 right, 3 only. So I'm not sure how they got 16 and 21, 20 wrong. So we'll just keep an eye on that then. So that's right. So question 22. Economic growth depends upon which of the following? Increasing the quantity of labor, lowering the price of goods and services, advancing technology. So here's the thing. Depend is a strong word because it means that you need to do both. Like you have to do these things to increase economic growth, and that's not the case. Like you can do either of these things, and the two things you can do is you can either increase the quantity of labor, or you can advance technology, or you could do both. Either, to say that it depends upon one is to say that it's a necessity rather than a condition, rather than a possibility, a sufficient but not necessary, right? And so, we're going to go ahead and pick 1 and 3, but I think the phrasing of that is an interesting question. But 1 and 3 should be the right answer. Growth means if you increase the quantity of labor, you're going to be able to increase your production because you have more people to work and put together your resources, and labor is a form of resource inherently. And by advancing technology, even if you kept the same amount of resources available, you would still be able to produce more because the technology allows you to assemble the resources more efficiently. You can think of the shift from assembling a car by hand to machines or assembly lines. So 1 and 3 are both correct. So question 22, 1 and 3, that's great. Question 23. When drawing a production possibilities frontier, which of the following is held constant? The amount of money in the economy. So again, we're only talking about resources, not about money. Number 2, the prices of goods and services. Again, the PPF does not make a kind of determination of prices. That's for supply and demand model. The PPF simply just tells us what's possible given the amount of resources and technology we have. So that's not going to be the right answer. C says the quantity of the goods and services that are produced. Again, that's something that's given by the supply and demand model, not by the PPF, and so we're not going to buy that answer as well. And finally, the available factors of production and the state of technology. And that is a correct answer. Factors of production are our resources, and state of technology says how can we put those resources together. And so that is what is being held constant when drawing a PPF. And if either of these things were to change, right, factors of production change or state of technology changes, then we would see a shift in the PPF from what it was before. So we're going to say available factors of production and the state of technology. That's correct here. Great. In 24, to increase its economic growth, a nation should do which of the following? And so we said, we have to either change factors of production or state of technology, or basically invest in things to create more productivity in the future. So encourage spending on goods and services. So that's consumption spending. And again, we said that if we're increasing growth, we have to give up some consumption spending in the current period because money is flowing towards investments rather than consumption, and there's a trade-off there. So it cannot be spending on goods and services. Similarly, it cannot increase current consumption because to increase economic growth, we would have to invest more and consume less. Encourage education because that increases the quality of labor. That is true, and that is one way in which you can invest in your resources. And so we would say that's certainly a way that you could increase economic growth. And finally, limit a number of people in college because they produce nothing. That's not the case. People get college educations, they become more high-skilled labor, and that's going to increase our ability to grow and possibly increase our technology as well. And so the correct answer is going to be encourage education because that increases the quality of labor. And so yes, question 24 is correct. And finally, the opportunity cost of one more slice of pizza in terms of soda, and so I'm assuming this is a two-good model, we assume there's only two of these goods. So number of pizza slices we have to give up in order to get one extra soda. And so I think that flips the relationship, right? It says we want one more slice of pizza. How much soda do we give up? Not how much pizza we give up. And so it's not going to be that correct answer. Total number of sodas that we have divided by the total number of pizza slices that we have. I'm actually not sure what that ratio would mean from an economic standpoint. I don't think it really means anything, but it's definitely not opportunity cost. And so, again, we are talking about the same idea of giving up something in order to get something else. But again, we want a different relationship than one given in A, but it's definitely not B. C says total number of pizza slices that we have divided by the total number of sodas that we have. Again, that's not the correct answer. I'm not really sure what that ratio would tell us. And finally, D, number of sodas we have to give up in order to get one extra pizza slice. And that is the correct answer. It says we want one more slice of pizza. How much soda do we give up? And it says this is the number of sodas we have to give up in order to get that pizza. And so that's going to be the correct answer. So number of sodas we have to give up in order to get one extra pizza slice. So yes, that would be the correct answer here. And so we've covered all of the questions, all 25 questions. There are 3 questions in which we take issue with. The first question is talking about what are the assumptions of the PPF, so question 12. And exists is because of scarcity of resources and just scarcity of resources, not unlimited technology. And unlimited technology assumes, infinite technology, that we don't have and would allow us to produce everything as much as we wanted it. So that's not going to be a condition of PPF. 16 talks about what are the reasons we might want, what do we have to do? What is the opportunity cost of increasing economic growth? And we said that one of the opportunity costs is that we have to, increase investment, and that means decreasing current consumption, which in turn is going to reap future consumption increases as economic growth leads to more resources being available. And finally, 20 is again on the same line about what do we give up when we do investment, and that's again going to be consumption in the current period in order to gain consumption in future periods. And so that's again something that we want to correct here. So these things correct. We're going to say solution is incorrect, even though they got 22 out of 25 questions correct. We're going to correct these 3, and we're going to mark that as incorrect there. So I believe that is the last question that we have for today. And so, hopefully all of that was helpful. We covered a lot of the different forms. We spent a lot of time on PPF, and that definitely should have been a very thorough understanding of all the different variations of PPF questions. And again, hope that these sets are helpful for you guys. And other than that, I hope everybody's staying safe and enjoy the rest of your week, guys. Oh, here we go.